Well, good evening, everybody. Tonight I'll be leading us in a song, and then we will get started. I'm just waiting for it to show up. Tell you what, whenever you see these guys that work in the sound room, you tell them thank you. They do a lot for us. Okay, break down the bread of life. That doesn't, oh, blowing the wrong pitch, sorry. Break thou the bread of life, dear Lord, to me, as thou didst break the loaves beside the sea. Beyond the sacred page, I seek thee, Lord. My spirit pants for thee, O living word. Bless thou the truth, dear Lord, to me, as thou didst bless the bread by Galilee. Then shall all bondage cease, all fetters fall, and I shall find my peace, my all in all. All right. Thank you for being here. And if you're joining us live or later online, thank you. I hope that this class has strengthened your faith, and I hope that it's honored your time. The song that we just sang, Break Thou the Bread of Life, has this in the first stanza: Break thou the bread of life, dear Lord, to me, as thou didst break the loaves beside the sea. And when Jesus fed 5,000 with the 5 loaves and 4,000 with 7 loaves, do you remember what the disciples did afterwards? They collected the fragments, remember? They collected 12 baskets full and then 7 baskets full of broken pieces that were left over. He could create food, but Jesus was not wasteful. Likewise, for the last 6 months, I have been collecting the handouts that were left over in the back of the auditorium. There are folders back there that have every lesson that I've done for the last 6 months as handouts. Please take a folder home. I don't want to take any home. There's plenty back there, and if you don't get one and you'd like one, let me know, and I can get another one made for you. So, anyways, please get one of those folders. Tonight, this is our review of the book of Daniel, and we have been in an in-depth study of this book for the last 6 months. This is going to be a greatest hits class. I'm going to assume that you will remember some of the things that we talked about as we go through this lesson. It will trigger some memories from you. And if you don't remember some of that and think, wow, I wish I remembered what that was about, grab a folder so you can go back and look at that chapter if you like. So, before I was preparing this lesson, I talked to my wife, and she told me, make it fun. Make it fun. And to honor her request, we're going to incorporate Jeopardy-style clues into the presentation. okay? Now, there's no money tied to this, and you can assign the categories in your head as we go through the questions, but I'm going to have these up on the slides to trigger some thought as we move through this. We're going to track 3 themes through the book as we go through this: the power of faith, the power of prayer, and none of that works without the power of God. And of course, this book, I have emphasized virtually every week that the dominant theme is what? Somebody, I want to hear you loud. What is the dominant theme of this book? It's the sovereignty of God. The sovereignty of God, okay? Especially over kings and kingdoms. And we saw this particularly in chapter 11 that we spent 3 weeks in, but we also saw this in other instances in the narrative section and in the prophetic section of the book. Do you recall Jesus' encounter with Pilate? John 19, starting at verse 10, he entered his headquarters again and said to Jesus, "Where are you from?" But Jesus gave him no answer. So Pilate said to him, "You will not speak to me? Do you not know that I have authority to release you and authority to crucify you?" Jesus answered him, "You would have no authority over me at all, unless," what? "Unless it had been given to you from above." At this, Pilate sought to release Jesus, and now consider King Nebuchadnezzar. It took Nebuchadnezzar a lot longer to understand what Pilate grasped right away when he was in the presence of Christ. It took him a while to acknowledge that God is sovereign. So, part 1 is the court narratives of the book. And remember, we talked about the book can be divided structurally in half. Chapters 1 through 6 are chronological. They are the court narratives. Chapters 7 through 12 are chronological. They are the prophetic visions. These chapters overlap. So if you were reading through this book sequentially, the way it's presented, and that's how we're going to go through this tonight, you would finish Daniel in the lion's den, and then you're going to hit chapter 7 and say, wait a minute, didn't we already hit this king before? So it would get confusing to you. But understanding as a reader, now you know this principle that they are chronological, but the chapters overlap. So Nebuchadnezzar was the first important king to appear in Daniel, and in fact, references to Nebuchadnezzar predate the book of Daniel. They predate Daniel's arrival in Babylon. God called Nebuchadnezzar, quote, "my servant," in Jeremiah chapter 25 and verse 9. And this prophecy was given before Nebuchadnezzar took Jerusalem 3 times. 3 times he went in and took Jerusalem. In 605 during the reign of Jehoiakim, in 597 during Jehoiachin's reign, and in 587 BC during the reign of Zedekiah. In 605, that's when he took Daniel and Daniel's 3 companions with him. And in 597 BC, during that last invasion, he took Ezekiel. So Ezekiel was a contemporary of Daniel, as was Jeremiah. Jeremiah would have been, in Daniel's eyes, coming into the king's palace as a young man, perhaps 15 years old. Jeremiah to him was an old man. So Daniel chapter 1, verse 1 and 2, this sets the stage for the rest of the book, this first chapter. Daniel 1, verses 1 and 2. In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand. Note that word, the Lord gave. Gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand with some of the vessels of the house of God. And he brought them to the land of Shinar, that's Babylon, to the house of his God, and placed the vessels in the treasury of his God. His God was Marduk, the thunderbolt-wielding king of the Babylonian gods. Marduk was a precursor to Zeus. The ancients robbed ideas from the other ancients. So he brings these vessels into the house of God. That God gave King Nebuchadnezzar victory over Jerusalem is important. God gave in that chapter, God shows up 3 times. And he enabled this king to defeat the Israelites. So here is a slide that we've had. I have a version of this on your handout that shows the chronological approach to the book of Daniel. And that second column is the chapters in Daniel. If you were to try to read it chronologically, that is the course that we took going through this class. So, Daniel 1 sets the stage. Here we are, and I call this the royal refusal. 3 times God gave something of value in this chapter. To Nebuchadnezzar in verse 2, he gave victory. To Daniel in verse 9, he gave favor. And to Daniel and his friends, he gave this. As for these 4 youths, God gave them learning and skill in all literature and wisdom, and Daniel had understanding in all visions and dreams. The king brought these 4 youths into Babylon for indoctrination. He brought youths from noble families who were good-looking and intelligent, and that was the purpose, was to indoctrinate them. Each of them received new names, and I've got the names on your handout. If you track down here, there's Daniel 1, and you flip the page, and it will show you their original names and what they meant, and their new names and what those new names meant. So this leads to our first Jeopardy slide. Here we go. And I apologize, I do not have the class or polish of Alex Trebek. In a Hebrew name, the suffix IAH signifies Yahweh. This suffix signifies God. Does anybody know? What is L? Very good. What is L? You see L all through the Bible. Daniel, Ezekiel, Joel. Cities, Beth El, house of God. You will see L all over the place in the Bible. Yes, very good. What is L? Daniel 1 ends by praising their wisdom, and Daniel used his skill in literature to write the book. Again, here we go, skill in literature. Daniel structured the book using a literary device. Here we go. Shaped like an X. Daniel used this to organize parts of the book of Daniel. Anybody? Very good. What is a chiasm? Thank you, Bonnie. That is correct. What is a chiasm? It's derived from the 22nd letter of the Greek alphabet, chi, or also pronounced chi. The X shape captures the structure. And here is one example from Jesus in Matthew 20, verse 16. The last will be first, and the first will be last. And you see the X pattern connects those words. This also turns into an ABBA pattern if you were to turn it sideways. And that's what we are dealing with most of the time through Daniel. The structures I've shown you have been that particular structure. And here we go. Daniel chapter 1 is structured as a chiasm. Now, on your handout, the very first thing I have there is the complex chiastic structure of the entire book. This is derived from a couple of commentators that I've consulted in preparing this material in their books. This is a chiastic structure, but here we go. This is Daniel 1's chiastic structure. Babylon defeats Judah, and a Judean outlasts Babylon. Who is the Judean who outlasts Babylon? Daniel. Okay, at the end of the chapter, he outlasts Babylon. Youths are taken for training, and then youths finish their training. And in the center, we have this key conflict, the desire to avoid foods and the success in avoiding these foods. Chiastic structures can be applied to sentences and to larger bodies of text. And this is an example of a larger body of text where it gets applied. The beginning and end of Daniel 1 set the stage. God gives Nebuchadnezzar victory. God gives Daniel wisdom. Daniel's service to the kings in Babylon lasts until another king. Here we go. Daniel served in Babylon until the reign of this king. Cyrus the Great. Who is Cyrus the Great? That is correct. Who is Cyrus the Great? He outlasts the kingdom of Babylon. Those are the chapter's bookends. So what's the central conflict in the chapter? To avoid meat and wine sacrificed to idols, and to avoid unclean foods, Daniel proposed this diet. I'm hearing it. Vegetables and water, right? Vegetables and water. And those are the principal reasons that he would do that. So that's the royal refusal. And Daniel 1 foreshadows two things. At the beginning of the chapter, we see Nebuchadnezzar takes the holy vessels out of the temple in Jerusalem. This is going to get reflected back to us in Daniel chapter 5 when the hand writes on the wall. Daniel's ability to interpret dreams closes the chapter. And again, we had this here. Daniel had understanding in all visions and dreams. And this becomes key throughout the early chapters and especially in the prophecies. That leads us to chapter 2. I've titled this one The Divine Showdown. There are multiple divine showdowns in the book. Dream interpretation comes into focus in chapter 2. Nebuchadnezzar has a nightmare, and he summons all the wise men of Babylon to tell him the dream and its interpretation. And what's their objection? Nobody's ever done this before. Tell us the dream, and we will tell you the interpretation. No, you tell me what I dreamt. By doing this, I will know that your interpretation is true. And they argue with him 3 times. This is recorded that they argue with him. And they refuse to tell him the dream, and Nebuchadnezzar is enraged. You see this. He is a quick-tempered person. He's enraged, and he orders the execution, not of these people that refuse him, but of all the wise men in Babylon. This would include Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And faced with execution, the executioner comes to their door, and Daniel asks for time. Let me meet with the king tomorrow, have an audience with the king, and the executioner grants him that. And what is Daniel's first response to the crisis? Prayer. Daniel models this for us. First response to crisis is prayer. And they pray, and God answers him, gives him the answer, and tells him what's in the dream. Again, this chapter is the chiasm. You can see the structure here. The king's dream is concealed, and then it's revealed at the end. Daniel requests an audience. He's granted an audience. And in the center, God reveals the dream to Daniel. And we talked about in chiastic structures, often the top of that pyramid is the most important point here. Why is this important? God is sovereign. God is the one in charge. He reveals the dream to Daniel. Of course, this dream came from God. So, he has this dream. And in Daniel 2, one other thing happens. here we go. Daniel is written in two languages, Hebrew and this lingua franca of Assyria, Babylon, and Persia. Yes, what is Aramaic? Specifically Imperial Aramaic. Very good. It shifts to this language in chapter 2, and this stays in Aramaic until the end of chapter 7. That section of Daniel, the Aramaic section, is also structured as a chiasm. So, I want to make sure I don't lose my place on my slides here. He sees this statue. And this statue has 4 metals. Remember, it starts with gold and it goes down to clay and iron at the feet. It goes from the most valuable metal to the least valuable material. It goes from the softest to the hardest, except for those feet, right? The shins of iron, but then the feet are clay and iron. And what happens to this statue in the dream? A giant stone is cut out with no hand, it says. It's cut out and it's thrown, hurled at the base of the statue, and the statue shatters. And the interpretation of the dream, Daniel tells him, "O king, you are the head. You are the head of the. You represent Babylon, and all these other metals represent a different kingdom." Now, perhaps Nebuchadnezzar saw his face in that face of the head. I don't know. That's complete supposition, but imagine how terrifying that would be. The scripture says that, we characterize this as a dream, but the scripture says that his spirit was struck as if you would strike a bell or strike an anvil. He was that terrified. All these dreams that these kings have in the book of Daniel are nightmares. They're all nightmares, and they all have strong emotional reactions to these dreams. So, Nebuchadnezzar summons all his wise men. They can't tell him the interpretation. Daniel gives him the interpretation, and he is rewarded. And Daniel recommends that his friends also be made officers in the kingdom, and that's what happens to them. Move on to chapter 3, the fiery furnace. The fiery furnace reflects the character of this hot-tempered king. Newly appointed officials, Daniel's 3 friends, had their faith tested. The Hebrew writer refers to this event and to the lion's den in Hebrews 11, verse 32 through 34. And what more shall I say? For time would fail me to tell of Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, of David and Samuel and the prophets, who through faith conquered kingdoms, enforced justice, obtained promises, stopped the mouths of lions, chapter 6, quenched the power of fire. Here we go, chapter 3. It's not coincidental that the writer of Hebrews couples those 2 things together, because they're found in the same book. So, architecture in the kingdom of Babylon was impressive. Here we go. Nebuchadnezzar built Ishtar's gate. This is the actual tiles, the fire tiles that were taken from Ishtar's gate. This is in a museum in Germany. You can go see this. You can see how tall this is compared to the people. Here is an artist's rendition of what that may have looked like at the time. They had all these glazed, fired tiles. Babylonian propaganda was powerful. This is a political statement to put this up here. Nebuchadnezzar erected a 90-foot gold statue, possibly a well-proportioned figure on a tall pedestal. He summoned the officials of Babylon to worship the golden image. He doesn't summon everybody, he summons the officials. This is a test of loyalty. When the 3 friends refused to bow down to the statue, the Chaldeans, who were like astrologers, Nebuchadnezzar's dad was a Chaldean. The Chaldeans brought a 3-fold accusation to the king. They disregard your authority. And I've got the wrong slide here. They disregard your authority, they don't serve your gods, and they disobeyed your order to worship. And they have a 3-fold response to this. We have no need to answer you in this matter. Our God whom we serve is able to deliver us. If God doesn't deliver us, we will not serve your gods. That's what these three men tell the king after he's confronted them. Massive kilns were required to fire the ceramic tiles that were used in these construction projects. Beyond that gate, there was a mile-long grand causeway into Babylon that on both sides of it had fired brick tiles, glazed tiles, that were blue and gold, dedicated to Ishtar. Here we go. Next question. Bricks excavated from Babylon bear the name and inscription of this king. This is not a trick question. Who is Nebuchadnezzar? Okay. Isn't that crazy? It's a fun fact there. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego refused and were thrown into the furnace. Remember, the men that brought them in there were consumed. But the king saw figures walking around inside the furnace. The narration switches to the king's view, right? I see three, and there's a fourth whose appearance was like the son of the gods. Now, here's another question for you. Babylonians saw stars as omens inscribed on a tablet of this color. Any guesses, anybody? Blue. It's blue, okay? So, on to Daniel 4. God shows his sovereignty at the end of chapter 3. Nebuchadnezzar praises God, but he quickly forgets. Nebuchadnezzar last appears in Daniel 4, and he's at ease in his palace. He dreams of a glorious tree. This is a figurative world tree from mythology that he dreams of. This tree is cut down at the decree of a holy one. Another nightmare. Here we go. The city Daniel lived in was given a name that meant Gate of the Gods. What is Babylon? Nebuchadnezzar called Daniel by this name, which means Bel, protect his life. What is Belteshazzar? Very good. Hearing the dream, Daniel was devastated. He loved the king. It meant the king would be judged and driven away to dwell with the beasts of the field for 7 periods. So he interprets this dream for the king. And this time the king doesn't ask him to tell me the dream. He tells him the dream first. And again, he's terrified. And Daniel realizes this is the bad omen for the king. The king will be judged, driven away to dwell with beasts of the field for 7 periods until he recognized that God was sovereign. Daniel counseled the king to practice righteousness and to show mercy to the oppressed. Perhaps he'll prolong your days. 1 year later, Nebuchadnezzar is looking over Babylon and he's boasting about his greatness. And immediately the prophecy is fulfilled. A word from heaven comes down, and he is driven out into the wilderness, and he remains a beast until he recognizes God is sovereign. At that, God restored Nebuchadnezzar's position, and King Nebuchadnezzar ended his testimony. Now, Daniel chapter 4 was written by who? Nebuchadnezzar. This hot-headed, heathen, pagan king who built temples to Marduk, worshipped Ishtar, and was a polytheist, his heart changed. This pagan king had plundered the temple. He deported the Jews. He built idols, and he cast God-fearing men into a fiery furnace because he was so angry. What is this proof of, folks? The depth of God's grace. This is evidence that God is long-suffering and wants us all to be saved. This moves on to chapter 5. Handwriting on the wall. This is a common colloquial saying, right? Comes straight out of this book. Daniel 5 presents two mystery kings. He's going to humble another king. Here we go. 4 cylinders found by archaeologists in 1854 testify of this king who, until that time, was lost to history. This was King Belshazzar. His name is very similar to Belteshazzar. King Belshazzar. His identity was unclear until 1854 when they found the 4 cylinders of Nabonidus. This is evidence that the book was not written during the Maccabean period. Those cylinders were lost before the Maccabean period. How could the writer who wrote this chapter use that name? Second mystery king shows up at the end of the book, and that still is an enigma to us. That would be Darius the Mede. So this chapter opens with a wild drinking party. King Belshazzar gets drunk and requests the temple vessels so that his concubines can drink from them. Remember chapter 1, Nebuchadnezzar had those. Drinking, they praise the gods of gold and silver, bronze, iron, wood, and stone. Daniel doesn't even dignify these gods with names. He just talks about the materials their idols were constructed from. This is another divine showdown, folks. Daniel chapter 5 and verse 5. Immediately the fingers of a human hand appeared and wrote on the plaster of the wall of the king's palace opposite the lampstand. And the king saw the hand as it wrote. And here Daniel uses a literary tactic to hold a reader's interest and keep them reading. Daniel used this literary tactic. This would be like the $1,000 question. Withholding information. Withholding information. Okay? When we went through this chapter, I showed you how he stretched out the enigma. The hand writes on the wall, but we're not told what it writes at the beginning when it writes. Daniel shows up to interpret what's there late in the chapter. But when he shows up, what does he do? He doesn't interpret right away. He has a few words to tell the king. He tells him how good Nebuchadnezzar was and how he's besmirching that reputation that Nebuchadnezzar had with his actions. Nebuchadnezzar would have never thought to do this. And he tells him of God and how God is sovereign. The king wants to know what's written on the wall, and he's terrified. Then he reads the words. Daniel records the words, and you're all the way down into verse 25 until you get the inscription. Now on your handout, I've got it for you. It's right there in the back of the page, right? And verse 26 through 28, this is the interpretation of the matter. Mene, God has numbered the days of your kingdom and brought it to an end. Tekel, you have been weighed in the balances and found wanting. Perez, your kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and the Persians. Daniel was rewarded that night. Remember, he said, we'll make you third in the kingdom. Whoever tells me what this means will be third in the kingdom. That means that he had a co-regent. He was a co-regent, so he couldn't make him second. Third in the kingdom, and that night the Medes and Persians under Cyrus the Great take Babylon. Belshazzar is slain, and the second mystery king, Darius the Great, ruled Babylon. Darius the Mede, I'm sorry, not Darius the Great, Darius the Mede. We still don't know the identity of this king. Some think it's an alternate name for Cyrus, because kings did have alternate throne names, but it's unclear. So this leads us to Daniel 6, which is why a lot of you wanted to take this class, Daniel in the Lion's Den. It's one of the reasons I wanted to teach it. So this new king loves Daniel. And in chapter 6, verse 3, then this Daniel became distinguished above all the other high officials and satraps, because an excellent spirit was in him. And the king planned to set him over the whole kingdom. So when Daniel's rivals learned about this, they tricked the king into signing a law that would entrap Daniel. Verse 7. The end of the verse, the king should establish an ordinance and enforce an injunction that whoever makes petition to any god or man for 30 days, except you, O king, shall be cast into the den of lions. And here we go, is the lion's den. And remember we talked about this? What's wrong with this picture? There is an opening at the top that permits light, right? He was put in there in the dark, and there was a stone that sealed the top of it. He was in utter darkness. The second thing that's wrong with this picture is the man depicted in there is probably not in his 80s. Okay? Daniel is in his mid to late 80s when this occurs. Otherwise, I love the lions. Cool-looking lions, right? So, here we learn Daniel's prayer habit. He prays every day, 3 times a day. Knowing the decree is signed, Daniel is not afraid to demonstrate his faith. Verse 10 of chapter 6, when Daniel knew that the document had been signed, he went to his house where he had windows in his upper chamber and opened toward Jerusalem. He got down on his knees 3 times a day and prayed and gave thanks before his God as he had done previously. He prayed 3 times a day, offering thanks. Daniel's accusers reported him to the king, and the king realizes they tricked him, and he works until sundown to deliver Daniel, but they tell him, "You've signed this law, it can't be changed." Night falls, and the accusers return, and they prompted the king to execute judgment. Verse 16. Then the king commanded, and Daniel was brought and cast into the den of lions. The king declared to Daniel, "May your God, whom you serve, continually deliver you." There's an exclamation point, but I'm not going to read it that way. Can you imagine how bold that would be? He is showing that he knows Daniel is a servant of God. And now, what is this king seeking? He seeks proof that God will reward the faithfulness of Daniel. Another divine showdown. And Daniel is put into this den at night, sealed in utter darkness. The king is powerless to save Daniel. And he seals the stone with 2 signets, one of his own and one of the Lord's that he has. And why 2? One, his own, is proof that he did not rescue Daniel. 2, his Lord's is proof that Daniel's accusers did not enter into the den and kill him. And that night he does not rest. No entertainment is brought to him. He fasts. He does not sleep. And in verse 19, the narrative continues. Then at break of day, the king arose and went in haste to the den of lions. As he came near the den where Daniel was, he cried out in a tone of anguish. The king declared to Daniel, "O Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, whom you serve continually, been able to deliver you from the lions?" What if Daniel didn't answer? What would that have told the king about God? The God that he says he calls the living God. Verse 21, then Daniel said to the king, "O king, live forever." This was a common greeting for a king, but this is a heartfelt, I love you. O king, live forever. Verse 22, my God sent his angels and shut the lions' mouths, and they have not harmed me, because I was found blameless before him, and also before you, O king, I have done no harm. The king orders Daniel's accusers and their families to be cast into the den of lions. My clock says it's 7:10, and I've still got a couple pages, so we're going to be flying. Part 2 is the prophetic visions. And you'll recall that Daniel can be divided in two halves. We talked about that. Here's the characteristics of apocalyptic visions. They're mediated by supernatural beings. They're highly symbolic, and they are difficult to interpret. And what's the passage, Bible class teachers, that you need to know when you get to something that's difficult to interpret? Deuteronomy 29:29. The secret things belong to the Lord our God. Okay? The first half of this book contains court narratives. The second half contains prophetic visions. Here we go. Transliterated from Greek. This Bible word literally means the unveiling. What is apocalyptic? Big Bible word, easy to understand, right? So the narrative chapters establish Daniel's credentials, God's power, and God's sovereignty. The prophetic chapters establish God's capacity to reveal future events. Among them, 4 world empires and the first and second advents of Christ. It provided Jewish readers with strong assurance their nation would endure. Chapters 7 through 12 are written in the first person accounts by Daniel, which impresses upon readers that Daniel received and wrote down these visions. So, Daniel 7, 4 beasts and a son of man. If I go over, is that okay with y'all? If you need to leave, it's okay. You're not going to hurt anybody's feelings. I understand if you've got to get somewhere. But we're going to run a little bit over. Daniel 7, 4 beasts and the Son of Man. Chapter 7 presents a vision that shook Daniel. Remember, these are not nice, fun little dreams. These are terrifying experiences. It begins with a nightmare, 4 winds stirring a great sea. 4 terrifying beasts rose successively from the water, each of them more frightening than the other. The vision shifts from earth to heaven, and from the darkness of night to light. Daniel saw a heavenly court, the Ancient of Days seated on a throne. The Son of Man descended from clouds and appeared on the throne, and he was given glory, dominion, and a kingdom. Daniel sought guidance from a heavenly witness while he was there, and was told the following, starting in verse 17. These 4 great beasts are 4 kings who shall arise out of the earth. But the saints of the Most High shall receive the kingdom and possess the kingdom forever, forever, and ever. Traditional interpreters see these kingdoms in the 4 beasts: Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greece, and Rome. We did talk about that there are variances of opinion, but that's the most traditional, most common path. The 4th beast, from that 4th beast, there was a little horn that arose, and the defining trait of that little horn was blasphemy. It wore out the saints like an old garment. Verse 25, he shall speak words against the Most High, and shall wear out the saints of the Most High, and shall think to change the times and the law, and they shall be given into his hand for a time, times, and half a time. God's people will be given into this oppressor's hand for a time, times, and half a time. Time is 1 period. Times doubles that period. And then we add half a time. Half a time is a period that is not concluded. It signals an abrupt end. It's half of 7. Half of the divine number is 7, the perfect period. This is half of that. Kingdoms in this vision reflect kingdoms from the vision that Nebuchadnezzar had in Daniel chapter 2. Remember, that statue had 4 materials and then the base. We also introduced prophetic telescoping when we talked about this, and here's the slide for that. A telescoping prophecy is realized in multiple fulfillments, working from a lesser, closer fulfillment to a more distant, greater fulfillment. Messianic prophecies will often telescope. And for an example of telescoping prophecy, you can compare Isaiah 61, 1 and 2 with Luke 4, 16 through 21. We did talk about this previously. Chapter 8, the vision of the ram and the goat. We move 2 years forward in Daniel's time, and the manuscript shifts from Aramaic back to Hebrew. Now the book ends in Hebrew. Here's the question. In Daniel 8, the goat represented this king from Macedonia. Who is Alexander the Great? In this vision, Daniel saw a ram and a goat. The ram charged all directions and was unstoppable. Gabriel is present, told Daniel the ram represented the kings of Media and Persia. Then a goat from the west struck the ram and trampled him, and Gabriel told Daniel this was a king of Greece. Historians identify this as Alexander the Great. Now, when you're given an apocalyptic vision and the messenger of God tells you what it means, it doesn't get any more authoritative than that, right? Following his victory, the kingdom was divided into 4. His generals took over, and then it gets down to 4. One little horn from the goat became great. This represented Antiochus IV Epiphanes. Daniel wrote at the end, but I was appalled by the vision and did not understand it. Even Daniel didn't understand it when he was confronted with this vision. Daniel 9 begins with 70 weeks and ends with 70 years. Bookends again. 9 years of Daniel's life passed, and he interprets the handwriting on the wall. He's put into a lion's den, and now it's 539 or 538 BC, and we arrive at this chapter. Daniel is reading the prophecy written by Jeremiah concerning the 70 years desolation of Jerusalem, and what is his first response? Prayer. Verse 3, then I turned my face to the Lord God, seeking him by prayer and pleas for mercy with fasting and sackcloth and ashes. I prayed to the Lord my God and made confession. Daniel confessed Israel's sins. Israel suffered for willfully violating their covenant with God. He ended the prayer with a petition. Here it is, verse 18 and 19. Oh my God, incline your ear and hear. Open your eyes and see our desolations in the city that is called by your name. For we do not present our pleas before you because of our righteousness, but because of your great mercy. What a great idea to keep in your head when you're asking for forgiveness. O Lord, hear. O Lord, forgive. O Lord, pay attention and act. Delay not for your own sake, O my God, because your city and your people are called by your name. While Daniel was speaking, Gabriel arrived, and he gave Daniel an additional mystery, a 70-week vision that concerned Jerusalem and an anointed one who would be cut off. Daniel understood this vision. He doesn't record his understanding for us. To us, the 70 weeks vision is still an enigma. All right, Daniel 10, chapters 10 through 12 are a single unit. For 3 weeks, Daniel mourned. Here we go. Daniel 10, 11, and 12. It's basically one event. God, and in verse 2 of chapter 10, in those days I, Daniel, was mourning for 3 weeks. I ate no delicacies, no meat or wine entered my mouth, nor did I anoint myself at all for the full 3 weeks. God sent a messenger immediately, but he was delayed 21 days by the prince of the kingdom of Persia. This would be a spiritual power. This isn't an earthly prince. Michael, the archangel, aided him so that he could come to Daniel and deliver the prophecy. Now, this messenger is not identified. If it was Gabriel, he would have said, this is Gabriel, right? It's a messenger. So what are the contents of this prophecy that he's come to deliver to Daniel, that he's left to deliver to Daniel? This starts in chapter 11. It's a 372-year symbolic history of Persia and Greece, the death of Antiochus IV Epiphanes in 164 BC. Goes all the way up to that point. And it focused on invading powers who trampled the promised land, primarily the Seleucids from Syria in the north and the Ptolemies from Egypt in the south. We're almost done, okay? The takeaway: God is sovereign in the affairs of kingdoms, and God will rescue his people. This is the overarching theme of the book. The vision ends with resurrection promises in chapter 12. It opens with promised deliverance. Chapter 12, starting in the end of verse 1. But at that time your people shall be delivered, everyone whose name shall be found written in the book. And many of those who sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake, and some to everlasting life, and some to shame and everlasting contempt. And those who are wise shall shine like the brightness of the sky above, and those who turn many to righteousness like the stars forever and ever. And the book closes with Daniel's promised reward. Verse 13, but go your way till the end, and you shall rest and shall stand in your allotted place at the end of the days. Chapter 12 is the first unobscured, clear reference in the Old Testament to the resurrection. So thank you for sticking around a little bit later. Thank you for sticking with me for 6 months to go through this material. It's been an honor to teach you. A lot of smart people in this room, and I hope I can teach you sometime in the future. Have a great week.